So I wanted to talk about something that comes up a lot in creative work, whether in your music, advertising, design, writing, whatever. And it's this idea that the best thing you can do is come up with something original. Something no one has ever thought of before. And I want to make the case today that that's the kind of wrong thing to chase. Not because originality doesn't matter, but because we've completely misunderstood what originality actually is. Let's get into it. So there's this line from this really old book, like one of the oldest books in existence, and it goes, "There is nothing new under the sun." Now, I find it a little funny that we keep quoting a 3,000-year-old text to prove that nothing is original. Like, the irony is right there, but the reason it keeps getting quoted is because it keeps being true. Every story has been told, every melody has been played, every insight has been had. And if you work in a creative field long enough, you start to feel this. You come up with what you think is a fresh idea, and then you Google it and find out someone did it in 1987. And it's a little deflating the first few times, and then it becomes kind of freeing once you accept it. But here's where I want to draw a distinction, because I think people collapse two things that are actually quite different. There's everything is derivative, which is a description. It's just observing how creativity works. And then there's originality is a myth, which is a value claim. It's saying originality doesn't matter, can't exist, and it shouldn't be chased. Those are not the same thing. And I think a lot of people hear the first one and conclude the second one. And that's where it gets muddy. Let me use music as an example, because I think it's the clearest one. There is a particular chord progression that underlies thousands of songs. If you play it on a piano right now, you'll instantly recognize at least 5 songs, like No Woman Nor Cry, Let It Be, thousands of pop songs from the last 50 years. The same 4 chords over and over again. So the question becomes, if the raw material is identical, what separates a transcendent song from a forgettable one? And the answer, I think, is that it's never about the raw material. It's about every single decision made around the raw material itself. The tempo, the texture, what instruments are playing, and how they're playing them, the key, what gets left out, which is huge, by the way, where the vocal sits in the mix, whether the song leads to genre expectations or quietly breaks them. Creativity becomes visible not in the notes themselves, but in the editorial judgment applied to them, the choices, particularly the taste. And jazz figured this out way before anyone else. Jazz has this tradition of standards. Songs like Autumn Leaves or All the Things You Are that hundreds of musicians have recorded. The melody is shared properly, the chord changes are shared properly. What you do with them in the moment with your particular voice and instincts, that's the art. So the form is communal, the expression is individual, and both of those things are true at the same time. Now let me bring this into my world for a second, which is advertising and brand strategy. Because the same thing applies, the same thing plays out there too. And I think it's actually a little more uncomfortable to admit. In advertising, the equivalent of chord progressions is insight, the underlying human truth that a piece of communication is built on. And if you've been in this industry for any length of time, you know that there are really only a handful of them. People fear not belonging, People want to feel like good parents. People want to be seen as competent. People are afraid of missing out. People want to believe they're better than average. These are the notes. These are the chords. And in every brief, in every agency, in every market is cycling through some version of these same truths. So does that mean advertising is all the same? Obviously not. And the reason it's not is because the insight is not the idea. The insight is the starting point. The idea is the specific, strange, precise execution that makes a universal human truth feel like it was discovered just now, just for you. Two agencies can work off the same exact brief, the same exact insight, and produce work that feels completely unlike each other. Because the creative leap, the transition from truth to expression, that's where the differentiation actually lives. So originality, in advertising at least, isn't about finding a new human truth. It's about the particular way you hold the truth you already have, the angle, the specificity, the courage not to over-explain it. So we've established that everything is derivative, and that creativity is really about recombination and judgment rather than pure novelty. Which brings me to the thing I suspect you've been waiting for me to get to. If creativity is just recombination, what exactly is wrong with what AI is doing? Because that's the uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this. And I think if you've been nodding along up until now, this is the part where it gets a little harder to stay comfortable. Here's the argument that makes AI seem like just another creative tool. If humans draw on everything they've ever read, heard, seen, and experienced, and AI draws on everything it's been trained on, aren't they doing the same thing? Pattern recognition, recombination, output. And honestly, I don't think you can dismiss that argument easily. I've thought about it, I've tried. But here's where I land, at least for now. Human recombination happens through lived experience. The inputs aren't neutral. They're not just data, they filter through loss, desire, confusion, joy, embarrassment, things you wished you'd said, things you can't stop thinking about at 2 a.m. When a songwriter writes about heartbreak, they're not just recombining prior songs about heartbreak. They're trying to make sense of a specific heartbreak. The art is the residue of the attempt. AI recombines without stakes. There's no particular heartbreak driving the output, no confusion it's trying to resolve, no specific truth it needs to get at. And I think that matters, not because suffering is required to make art. That's a romantic idea I'm actually suspicious of. But because purpose matters, direction matters. The fact that a human making something is trying to communicate something specific to someone specific, that intentionality shapes everything. Here's where I'll complicate my own point. I'm not sure how long that distinction holds. Because as AI gets better, and as the outputs get more precise and more emotionally resonant, at some point we're going to have to ask whether intentionality behind a work actually matters to the person experiencing it. If a piece of music moves you, does it matter? Does it matter where it came from, grief, or from a language model? I genuinely don't know. And if I think anyone who tells you they know is probably a little overconfident. Let's talk about authorship. Because this is where things get really philosophically messy. If you spend your life listening to John Coltrane and that influence shows up in your playing, you're a jazz musician. That's just how it works. The influence is absorbed and transformed and becomes part of your voice. But if you train a model on 5,000 jazz musicians simultaneously, and it produces something that sounds like all of them and none of them specifically, who made that? Who's the author? The legal answer right now is contested and unsatisfying and probably going to be argued in courts for the next decade. The philosophical answer is honestly worse. But here's where I think the conversation is actually heading, and I find this interesting. Authorship might need to shift from origin to curation. The author isn't necessarily the person who generated the raw material. The author is whoever made the real choices about what to keep and what to discard, what to emphasize, what to leave alone, what direction to push in. And interestingly, that puts the human back in the loop. Even in AI-assisted work, the person who's just hitting generate and accepting the first output isn't really an author in any meaningful sense. But that's the person who's using AI as a tool, making genuine creative decisions about what it produces, pushing it towards something specific. That person is authoring something. The tool changed. The act of authoring didn't. At least that's how I'm thinking about it right now. So where does all of this land? I think the myth isn't that original ideas exist. Some ideas genuinely feel new, and that feeling is real even if it's not technically accurate. The myth is that originality is what makes something matter. Because when you think about the creative work that's actually stayed with you, the song you keep coming back to, the ad that made you feel something unexpected, the book that changed how you see something, it usually wasn't original in a pure sense. It was recognizable. It took something you already felt but couldn't name and named it precisely. That's the creative act, not conjuring something from nothing. Taking what already exists in the world, in the culture, in the shared human experience, and arranging it in a way that produces recognition in another person. And that recognition can come from a first-time artist or a seasoned one. It can probably come from a well-prompt AI, but it requires a receiver, someone who brings their own pattern of existence to the encounter and finds something true in it. Which means creativity might be less about what's in the work and more about what happens in the space between the work and the person experiencing it. And if that's true, then the question is this original? Might just be the wrong question entirely. The better question might be, does this feel true? And that, I think, is still a human judgment for now. All right, that's what I've been thinking about. Let me know in the comments what you think, especially on AI, especially on the AI question, because I'm genuinely unresolved on that one, and I'm curious where you land. And if this is the kind of thing, if this is interesting to you, the psychology behind creative work, what makes ideas stick, how the industry is changing, feel free to follow me, subscribe, all that usual stuff, because that's basically what this channel is. I'll see you in the next one.